Sorry, I was just getting a glass of water and things.
Right, we're ready for you now.
Oh, right. Okay, so you want me to start? That's fantastic.
Yes, thank you.
Well, good morning for me. Good evening for you. I'm very sorry not to be with you in person. That's due to some unfortunate health problems I've had. But I am very happy to be able to talk to you live like this. This is actually the first time I have live streamed from our little studio in our office in Milton Keynes. So I'm hoping it will work smoothly for you. But it does mean that it's a slightly higher quality, I hope, than you'd get normally through Skype. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the future of English, particularly the social dimension. This is something which is a project that I've been working on for really over 20 years. And in fact, it's 20 years this year is the anniversary of the publication of The Future of English, which I published with the British Council. And a lot of things happened in that year, 1997. Not least in the UK, there was a general election, which was the election in which the Tory party and Margaret Thatcher's party was defeated, and Tony Blair and the Labour Party came into power. And there was a major shift of emphasis to issues more like social welfare, for example. We were not yet into austerity, which is playing out now. But this changed the whole global scene for UK English language teaching and the role of organisations like the British Council. Some of you will remember The Future of English. It was published as a large format, almost magazine-y kind of publication, because it was designed to reach business managers, people involved in language policy, not English language professionals so much, or academics. And so it had a lot of arguments, closely argued evidence that was drawn from the kind of thing you might see in The Economist rather than an English language magazine. And something else happened in 1997, which was significant during the production of The Future of English. And that, of course, I mean, today is a historic day in Hong Kong. This is the 20th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong back to mainland China. And indeed, I had a little bit of a problem in the production of The Future of English because it had a foreword by Prince Charles, the heir to the throne here, but he couldn't actually authorize his signature because he was on the royal yacht heading for Hong Kong to hand over Hong Kong to China. Now, The Future of English is still available for free download on the internet, and the other publications I'm just about to talk about are also available. If you Google me or the title, you'll find these texts somewhere as PDFs. Now, The Future of English, I would say in summary, found a number of things. I mean, one was that despite the fact that in 1997 there was a kind of sense of triumphalism in amongst native-speaking countries, the United States and the UK, that somehow English had triumphed as the global language against all others. I was saying, and that's why I had a big question mark on the front cover, wait a moment, it's actually a little bit more complicated than we think. And I actually introduced ideas like complexity theory to demonstrate what I meant. That there are so many different issues, driving forces, if you like, which all interacted. I was saying that one of the main drivers of change was actually demographic, and I'll explore that in greater detail soon, because it's one of the ways in which the shape of the world is changing most rapidly at the moment. And I said globalization, which was something which was rapidly developing then, largely because of the role of China in manufacturing, that globalization was encouraging the spread of English, but the spread of English also actually aided globalization. And that's a typical kind of problem we have in this area. We're not sure what is the independent variable and the dependent variable. You know, does the spread of English cause more teaching of English, or does the wider teaching of English cause a greater use and spread of English? They actually interact with each other in a dynamic way. And I also struck a note saying, hey, the future of English is going to be determined more by non-native speakers than the native speakers. So this was already part of the question mark, was querying the centrality of the native speakers in the whole global English enterprise. I got one thing wrong, which is that I said in 1997, do you know there seems to be a major shift going on in the way key decisions are taken within corporations, within the economy, towards a bottom line that was based as much on social justice, on the environment, etc., as on economic efficiency. And there was a lot of evidence at the time that there had been a trend towards this. But of course then we ran into the, you could call it the neoliberal era, which has now become so naturalized that it's difficult for people to break away from this idea that public services should be privatized, that wealth basically is should be allowed to anyone who can actually play the neoliberal game, which means that there's been a massive shift of wealth in many countries from the middle classes and the poorer people to a very few wealthy people. And I would say English is actually implicated in all of this in complex ways. So this is something which I think changed. But languages and language futures are about people. They're not about the grammar or vocabulary of a language, they're about the people who use them. And this is why I found demography and demographics so interesting. Now I want to show you now something which I used to show people when I published, or shortly after I published, The Future of English, which were demographic projections for the number of native speakers of different languages. Now I'm going to show you as it was then and talk about some of the ways that it has changed now, but I'm not updating it because the whole notion of the native speaker has become a lot more problematic in the last 20 years. And this kind of idea of modeling numbers of native speakers seems much less interesting than it used to be. So here is a graph on which I can plot across a century from 1950 to 2050 the estimated number of speakers of different languages. So here is French, and the vertical axis is in hundreds of millions of speakers. Can I just warn you that there's a slight problem with my graphic here and that the baseline is offset a bit. So if you could just imagine, add about 50 million or something onto the bottom there. But the relative positions is correct. Now French is one of the main rivals of English, or historically has been, as a kind of global and diplomatic language. And of course there's some interesting things going on at the moment in Europe of people suggesting that the role of English will become less important in Europe when Britain leaves the EU. That's not likely to be the case, by the way. If anything, I think the use of English will increase. But we have languages like Italian, which are likely to become less used in future, purely because of demographic reasons. The population in the places where Italian is spoken as a first language are declining. German is actually the first, it's the biggest language, if you like, in terms of speakers in Europe. It's not English. And that's holding its own over the next few years. Japanese is in demographic decline at the moment. Russian is in an even worse situation, although it's quite difficult to manage the statistical continuity after the breakup of the Soviet Union. All the statistics went into different countries. But as a reminder of the changing landscapes of the world of language, here is Portuguese. It's one of the most rapidly rising languages, and that's because of Brazil, of course. And it's not just the numbers of speakers of Portuguese which is increasing. For quite a while, Brazil, as one of the BRIC countries, the new emergent economies, it looked like Portuguese was going to be backed by some kind of economic clout as well. And there are other languages, particularly in South Asia, Bengali, Bangla, which are growing very fast. In fact, just as an aside, one of the fastest growing areas now is sub-Saharan Africa. And I don't have these modeled here because the demographics of Africa in 1997 were pretty dire, not least because of the number of people dying of AIDS, parents, teachers, whole generations being wiped out. But that seems to be stabilized now, and many populations in sub-Saharan Africa are growing both in number and economically. Now here's where English set in the projections appeared in 1997. It's doing pretty well compared to these other bunch of languages I've got, but there are one or two other languages in the world that were catching up. Spanish is one because it's spoken, of course, very widely in Latin America, and who knows whether Spanish has actually just overtaken English or not. The idea of a native speaker is so now diffuse that let's just say that they're probably about equal in the world. And it's also true of Hindi Urdu, which is coming up into the same area. But the language which was clearly rising fastest was Arabic. And I said in 1997, we're going to be hearing a lot more about Arabic speakers and their activities in the world over the next 2 decades. I think probably that one was an accurate prediction. Now there's a language here that I haven't got on the graph yet, which of course is Chinese. I haven't put it on yet because it won't fit onto this graph. But I'm working on a computer. I can rescale the graph in order to fit on Chinese. And it's up there somewhere. That's how the projections looked in 1997. I'm going to look in a more detailed way at them shortly because they're not only very interesting, but I think they're going to have a big influence on the future of English, not just in East Asia, but also in the rest of the world. Now, modeling that is actually quite difficult because it's not just modeling the population of China. As I'm sure you're aware, not everyone in China speaks Mandarin, Putonghua, as their first language. And in fact, at the time, it was less than 50% of the population. It's now higher than that. What I had to do was model language shift, if you like. What proportion of the, what size would the population be, and what proportion of the population would be speaking Mandarin as their first language. And I think the current government target is to reach 80% in the next, I'm not quite sure how many years, decade or something. So we're still only at about 70-something% of the population in the official statistics speak Mandarin as a first language. Now, when I first showed these graphs, people said, oh, so Chinese is going to take over from English. It's going to become the world language. And so I had to introduce another line. I said, no, 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 no. If you look at what's happening to English, of course, the big growth, as I said earlier, is among non-native speakers. If you try and model its use as a global language, as a lingua franca, all of the other sort of terms that we have for English, we have to rescale the graph again. And English started growing as an international language, as a global language, very rapidly at the turn of the millennium. I've got a little kink at the top of that. That's just a smoothing error. It's nothing exciting. And it's been growing that fast. So that's the relative story of global Mandarin and global English, if you like. Now, as I said, since 1997, we've had a lot of discussions about the whole role of the native speaker, the whole concept of the native speaker, the role of native speaking teachers as opposed to non-native speaking teachers. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I would commend to you this book. You will probably know Peter Medjas, who wrote a book a long time ago called The Non-Native Teacher. And this is a kind of update of the original text with commentary on what has happened since around these ideas. Peter Medjas is a very interesting man who not only was an English teacher but served as I think a minister of education in Hungary. He knew the whole business from many different sides, and he himself is, I think, a brilliant speaker of English, but nevertheless suffered from a kind of lack of confidence, he said, as a non-native teacher. That was actually distributed for free at IATEFL, and I think it may be available on the internet. There will be other ways of getting hold of that. IATEFL was celebrating its 50th anniversary earlier this year. Now, if you wanted to create, say, an MA course on the futurology of English, it would cover a lot of different areas. There would be looking at the language itself. Many people have done that and are interested in what language change, pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, new varieties of English. We could look at the range of domains in which English is used. We could look at issues around proficiency of English, and that is actually a very interesting topic at the moment. Since 1997, the whole discourse around the Common European Framework of Reference has really changed the landscape of standardization of language testing, of the ideas of can-do statements associated with different levels of proficiency, and how they might relate, for example, to the workplace. We also have, we could look at curriculum reform, things like lowering the age of teaching of English to young learners, and so on and so forth. I won't just go through the list here. Hopefully you can read it. But I have taken the view that there are one or two, perhaps four really sort of key areas that interact with each other. One is demography, another is the economy, the third is technology. Sadly today I won't be able to talk about some of the very interesting issues that have arisen around technology, and the fourth is politics. And if you like, society merges as an accommodation between these different issues. Now, the next, sorry, have you not been seeing those slides? I beg your pardon. English Next was a publication of 2010, which was a snapshot of what was happening to English in the world. And you can get this again on the internet. And then, sorry, that was 2006. English Next India was 2010, and that was an attempt at looking at a particular country. And then, more interesting for us today, I looked at South China and what was going on in that area of South China, Guangdong, Hong Kong, which was rapidly developing economically and changing the whole role of English. This book, published by Cambridge English, is also available for free download. Now, I'm aware that time is already moving on. I just want to say something very briefly about one of the changes in the language area, although it's not my main topic in the linguistic area. And one issue for me is the erosion of national varieties. The big question that people used to ask is, should we be teaching American English or British English? Well, I mean, that answer has been made by both in Europe and places like China, and that the distinction between these varieties is really becoming very blurred. And that's partly because many of the institutions which maintain standards have been weakened. If you look at the British, well, it used to be a British newspaper, The Guardian, that was very rigorously copy edited in British English. It has a US office now, and most of its US news is coming from and being sourced from there. If you look at their website, there is quite a mix of US English and British English, particularly in spelling, but also in grammar. And I think software is having a big effect here, because the default spell checker is often US English now, and people are very lazy about checking spellings, keeping their different English dictionaries and spell checkers up to date, and so on. And perhaps the last point I have here is one of the most interesting for me. Some expanding circle countries, that is where English was traditionally taught and used as a foreign language, are now becoming norm creators. Now, that's not quite the same as developing a kind of indigenized China English. That is, I think, happening. But we're getting with, for example, I used to notice this in Hong Kong a lot, because Hong Kong has basically used British English as its norm, and mainland China has largely used US English. But so much stuff is imported into Hong Kong now from the mainland that we were getting with it a lot of US English smellings, and things were just getting confused. An example of the kind of change that's in progress is, just to take a simple one, this is in a Japanese railway station. On one side of the corridor was a book kiosk. That reads fine to me as a native speaker. But on the other side was a books kiosk. Now, which is right? Normally, we use the singular when, like a £5 note, not a £5 note, when it's qualifying another noun like that. But this does seem to be something which is unstable and which is changing, and the use of the plural seems perhaps very widespread in second language and foreign language countries. Here's another example that I found at the IATEFL Jobs Fair just in April. You go to their jobs fair. Here's King Saud University advertising a job fair. Seems fine to me. But IATEFL itself referred to a jobs market, which I don't think we would have seen 20 years ago when I published The Future of English. Right, I'm now going to get on to some interesting demographic things and try and talk you through what's happening in China and why it's going to affect all of us. And also just why it's actually quite complicated making inferences about the economy and English from data like this. I'm going to show you a graph, an animated graph, of the age structure of China from 1950 to 2100. That's a very long span, but it means that the first 60 years or so, 70 years are going to be history, and then the rest are projections. Now, I'm using data here which has only just been published about 2 weeks ago by the United Nations. So it's the most recent data we have. And each column represents a 1-year cohort. So the leftmost column are the babies under 1 year old. And the furthest right, are the most elderly people, which in 1950, you've got a sort of slightly higher bar there because it's people aged 80 and over. Now, I've roughly coded these as green as dependents in education, not contributing to the economy. Blue is the main ages of the workforce, and brown as dependents again, pensioners and people who need to be looked after both financially and in terms of healthcare and so on. So let's look at what's happened, and it's very interesting. If you have a particular interest in one age cohort, like 14-year-olds, like university entrance at age 19 or whatever, you could look at that particular bar and see what's happening. You're seeing some very interesting troughs and peaks, which are due partly to the impact of the one-child policy. And these ripple through the age range, creating all kinds of havoc in terms of planning for school places, numbers of teachers, employment prospects, what's happening to sort of senior management, if you're in the middle of the trough. And then, of course, a familiar pattern in most developed countries is an aging population. But there's also here a decline in the total population. And this has been subject to quite a lot of debate within China in the last few months, because these are actually the official figures. These are the figures that are endorsed by the Communist Party, by Beijing, and many people are saying, no, the situation is much worse than this. We'll come on to that in a moment. But just look here. You've got a workforce, that blue zone, which is it's probably about half what it was. The implications of that are extraordinary, because if you have a workforce which has halved, in order to maintain your national wealth, your GDP, at the same level, every single worker has to be twice as productive. So they have to earn twice the wealth. That means they have to be much more highly skilled. They can't be unskilled migrant rural laborers coming into assembly factories in Guangdong and doing some tiny little job helping assemble an iPhone. They have to be a person with skills who is able to help design or market or reprogram the robotic arms that are replacing the workers. So there's one kind of story, and of course my interest is how does English fit into that? Is English one of the key 21st century skills that certainly the higher skilled workforce, the engineers, the designers, and so forth will need? And at what level of proficiency will they need it? Now, the one-child policy has had a major impact on this, but even if, as they're now doing, they're saying, no, you can have more children if you want, it's not actually happening. Most of the women who would be able to have more than one child now are over the age of 35. Excuse me. And there is a trend in all countries that as people become more urbanized, more middle class, they don't want more children. They become a hit on their lifestyle rather than, in the rural areas, a necessity for looking after you and the farm in your old age. So people are actually speculating now that the drop in population in China is likely to drop to under 600 million by the end of the century, and might even continue to go down to as low as 280 million by 2150. So this would completely reshape the world. Now, I'm going to, that just shows the overall population envelope, so it's looking like that lower blue line. Now, this is happening at the same time or as part of a general global trend in which we're seeing a missing middle in the job market. This is a quote from my research in India, where one of the companies that recruit nationally for all kinds of jobs are saying, look, we've got these cheap jobs that don't pay very well at one end, and we've got a lot of very well-paid professional jobs. What's happening in the middle? And this is applying to the level of English proficiency as well that many employers are wanting. This is coming from Brazil, and my research in Brazil. We don't know what the good intermediate fluent means in terms of sort of common European framework of reference, but what we can see is that employers are saying we either need a little bit of English or we need very good English. And do you know, that actually mirrors exactly what I found in Hong Kong, where the government had done quite a lot of research of its own on the different levels of proficiency in English that were needed for different job types. And what I did was look at the structure of employment in Hong Kong and how that had changed. And in 1993, it was indeed most of these job types, most of employment required low levels of English, A1 or 2, and only the professionals needed C1. By 2009, just the changing structure of employment meant that C1 plus was the most sought after level of proficiency by not just by employers, but by the jobs that are available that people were actually employed in. And the next most common was the lower ones. And the intermediate levels are in decreasing demand. And I'm seeing this right across the world at the moment. We're seeing more service jobs in like personal services, hotel, restaurants, bars, and so on, where A1, A2 is enough for the staff to be able to communicate with their patrons. And then at the other end, we've got professionals working in the knowledge industries and so on, where we're beginning to realize that B1, B2 is just not sufficient. So the new gold standard is at least C1. It's being inflated even further. People are talking about C2 now. And I don't know what that means for the language teaching business, because the education systems of the world have been largely based on the premise of trying to get students from nothing, from A1, A2 perhaps, through to intermediate level before they leave. So this whole question of how countries can produce the C1, C2 professional English speakers that the economy needs is still very, I just don't know quite how people are going to muddle through. There's obviously a kind of a point of failure there. So just to conclude here for the moment, I talked about complex systems theory in the future of English and how we could apply it to the future projections of the popularity of English and the use of English. But there's one interesting aspect of this. Anyone involved in complex systems theory will tell you, like weather forecasting, that you can get into situations where things seem fairly stable. You know, in weather forecasting now, you quite often get a confidence level attached to the forecast. You will have rain 80% likely. And then in other cases, the confidence level drops. We've got a situation in the UK at the moment, where we're not sure whether tomorrow will be a fine, warm day or whether it will be like today, cool and wet. And I think with English, we have moved into an area, a zone where things are becoming more unpredictable. And that's partly because of the economy, technology, and the political changes that seem to be going on globally at the moment. So I'm going to wind up there because we need a bit of time for questions. And I'm going to put on some headphones so that I can hear you clearly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Do you hear me? No?
I can hear you, but not very clearly.
So I think we can ask a couple of questions, but for the system, the tradition of the sound is not clear. So ask question, then Mr. Beck will type his or her question through the Skype. Right?
You won't be able to see what I type.
Oh, you're right? Then ask questions.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent, thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear you discuss larger trends, demographics, and the like. I hate to be very selfish, but as an English teacher, do you have any thoughts or opinions about what I should be considering for myself as I prepare to face these coming years?
The demand for English teachers will continue to go up. The kind of fetishism for native speakers will decline. People are already looking much more carefully at your qualifications as a teacher and your experience as a teacher. And yes, proficiency in English is very important, but people are no longer, I mean, there are places I'm sure this happens in South Korea and other countries in the region, where if you're blonde, fair-skinned, you will get employed by many language schools above a local non-native speaker who is much more highly experienced and trained. That kind of situation is now declining, partly through tightening government regulation, but also it's a kind of market shift as well. But I would say you're either working in the young learners, elementary kind of stages, or you need to be focusing on the higher level skills. There's a big problem, for example, at the moment about getting students from school up to the level required by universities in English. No one seems to be taking clear responsibility at the moment for that in many parts of the world. But the universities, logically, especially if they're teaching any courses through English, require at least C1 level from their students. And they don't have it. We know that they don't have it.
Dr. Graddol, thank you very much for your insightful talk. You mentioned the 4 different factors that may impact the spread of English. First one was demography, and then technology, and politics, and what was the second one? Oh, anyway, I was wondering, what is the potential impact of a new technology on the spread of English? For instance, I think at this conference we talked about artificial intelligence and Google Translator. Maybe some people think that maybe it will decrease the need for foreign language teaching, maybe teaching of English as a global language. And you mentioned the increasing uncertainty of the future of English. I'm wondering, whether you can speculate on the potential impact of new technology on the future of English.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and it spans both the role of technology in English teaching and how that's affecting teachers, but also, as you say, things like Google Translate. We've been saying for decades that the ability to translate from one language to another accurately is just around the corner. And it's still just around the corner. I mean, Google Translate is terrible. And you can see the impact of that in places like mainland China, where we're seeing a lot of public information signs that just don't make sense at all, or are somewhat sort of hilarious. And Beijing's having one of their kind of periodic cleanup campaigns to try and improve that. But one of the things that's going on, which is counter to the effect of technology in some ways, is, well, in one way, is that spoken language has become much more important. Listening and speaking, whether it's on Skype like this or whatever, are the sought after skills. Employers want people who can speak and communicate clearly in English, and yet all of our kind of education systems are premised on prioritizing reading and writing, partly because they can be done more cheaply, they can be done at scale, and of course technology can be used much more easily for doing that on virtual platforms. So the big shift we've seen in English teaching in many parts of the world of shifting exercises onto computer platforms, which may be tied in with ideas like flipped classrooms, where students are even working from home, adaptive learning technologies. All of these are really focused on reading and writing and not on speaking. We have a proliferation of tests now. All of the main publishers are trying to get in to, we used to have a system where there were kind of honest brokers and third parties like Cambridge English or even sort of TOEFL in a way. They specialized in independent assessments of proficiency of English. And then there was a major change as the publishers of course books tried to create their own suites of tests and lock students in to a vertical kind of integrated system. And this has happened to Cambridge as well, where they used to produce course books that would prepare students for any of the big language tests. It's happened at Oxford University Press, it's happened at Pearson, and so on. Now, that has actually led to, I think, a deterioration in the assessment of spoken language skills. They can't be cheaply and rigorously tested at scale. And yet that's the sought after skill that's in demand.
Please give me a big close again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope to see you next time, actually, in Seoul.
Please do.
Okay.
Bye.
Good. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
All right.